Was picking up and welcome everybody. With that introduction, uh, generously provided by Allison, I did work on the board of licensure for social workers under a different administration, and a new governor came in, and then that was that. So we're seeing some politicization there, but it was a very interesting experience. And I think that one of the things that really struck me in my time on the board is seeing the extent to which boundaries and boundary crossings and boundary violations were quite often the source of consumer complaints of social workers. Fortunately, there were few and far between. We're doing very well as a profession and upholding ethical standards of practice. But for those times when the line was crossed, it was almost inevitably about some form of inattention to boundaries, either their personal boundaries, professional boundaries, and what have you. It always does my heart good to see people come for an ethics presentation because I think back in the day when I would attend ethics presentations, they were almost always about things like liability, documentation, and risk management. It was like, ugh. And to really be able to step up and kind of at a higher level look at, well, what are ethics? What are social work ethics? How do they apply to the work we do? How do they intersect with clinical and community practice? Are really important. Um, so um, I am at Boston University School of Social Work, as Allison mentioned, and we do have a an ethics course that all students will take as they're launched into their careers. And we feel a little braggy about that because we're one of the few programs that really does offer a full semester course, which seems a little odd to me because the core and the basis of our profession are our ethical responsibilities and duties towards our clients to ensure equitable, just, anti-oppressive treatment. So I'm really heartened to see so many of you turn out today. Hopefully, it'll be worth your time. I know the format on these large Zoom sessions can feel a little remote, so there are opportunities that will be provided along the way to hear from you, to provide some opportunities to add comments or questions in the chat. And then towards the about three-quarter point, we'll have an opportunity for you to meet and engage in conversation with each other in breakouts. So, you know, the issue about boundaries we'll be spending a great deal of time with today, but I think back in the day when I took my clinical training, boundaries was, if it was discussed at all, it was like, do not cross the sexual boundary with your client. If you see them in the supermarket, don't say hello or have a long conversation with them before that, and probably don't hug them. That was about the extent of my training and boundaries in in my graduate education. I like to think that we've come a long way since then in really looking and understanding the nuances and the importance of boundaries in all forms of our professional relationships. So that's in large part what I want to attend to today. So before we get to that, Allison did a lovely job in priming the pump in terms of um, having people introduce themselves. But the question I want to ask is, why are we here? I don't mean that in an existential way, but why are we here to the specific training? So for those of you who have introduced yourselves based on your name and where you're located, what region of the country, feel free to just chime in and just say, what's one hope or goal that you would have for this time today? And we may not get to every hope and goal, but take a moment and think about what it is that compelled you to spend 2 hours of your time with us and with me. And as you go into the chat, I'll just try to capture a few of them as we go along. Um, New hints and ideas. I'm an ethics boundaries trainer. Excellent. Um, Other hopes and goals. Folks from around the country, a lot of folks from the West Coast, welcome. Local Somerville, Waltham, Massachusetts, welcome. Challenges in social work practice, uh, staff development and training of elder care staff, increased clarity around self-disclosure. Yes, we will get to that. Clear information on what makes sense in utilizing use of self. Excellent. Questions and goals, I'm happy to say will comprise part of our time together today. Ways to help volunteer staff and interns with boundaries that sometimes get blurred. Yes, blurry boundaries. learning about best practices, how to keep it real while holding boundaries, how to have authenticity and a connection, and at the same time being able to maintain professional boundaries in ways that don't feel cold or rejecting. Yeah, being able to redirect clients towards their goals. Yes, sometimes when people are very curious about us, what would you think? What would you do? Da, da, da. How do we gently redirect people? How do we kind of hold the treatment frame? And thinking, and again, with the clinical practice lens, I do want to also acknowledge macro and community-based practice. Insight and cultural differences impact understanding of boundaries, how to navigate those nuances with diverse client populations. Excellent. Yes, very different contexts. Um, Thank you for the large California turnout. Wow. Insight into cultural impact, uh, balance between personal and professional settings. Very good point. We will discuss that throughout. Very good. How to express boundaries without without sounding rude. Yeah, very good. It is hard because we feel boundaries, I think, connote restrictions and rules and rigidity, but I think again, it's how to reinforce it in a collaborative way, whether it's with regard to community-based practice, clinical practice, and that may in fact speak to a feeling we have that boundaries tend to be restrictive or they tend to reinforce, I don't know, white supremacy culture and da 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 da. But hopefully, what we can do today is really open up a dialogue in terms of thinking about the various ways that boundaries manifest. How do we know when they're crossed? How do we know when they're blurred? How do we know when they're violated? And it may not be immediately readily apparent. Um, Focus and Worcester, balance and insight. Maybe a couple more comments. Providing effective communication with staff when setting boundaries. Yes, so I think that idea of how to leverage your relationship with a client population, how to help train staff who have more direct interactions without feeling shaming or negative, or the clients may be asking or being too much. Very important. Building skills for toolkit. Excellent. Very, very good. All right. So again, feel free to pop more of your hopes and goals into the chat. And again, warm welcome to everybody who's here. I wish I had a chance to see you all. We have 91 participants, so a very large group today. But I do want to again attempt to make this as interactive as we can, given that large number. So, some of you had suggested already in the chat, we have some ideas and some work to do today. First of all, defining what is a professional relationship. What are boundaries within a professional relationship? I know it sounds like duh, like a pretty basic thing, but I think it's really important to be clear on like the distinctions and the areas of overlap between personal and professional boundaries. So we want to address those and play around with those a little bit and think through what that might look like when we kind of come up to a point where am I in a professional role? Or am I in a personal role? Am I a social worker 24/7? Do I ever get to go off the clock after work and engage in personal kinds of relationships with people with whom I have a professional relationship? Interesting, tricky, murky stuff. Um, we want to be able to begin to think about applying an ethical framework for decision making and boundary issues, and really to try to make it hands-on in terms of thinking about how do you state boundaries in ways that feel respectful, relational, developmental, and helpful. Um, Third is to differentiate between boundary crossings, boundary violations, and dual relationships. And I think often those terms get sort of conflated. Like, when does a boundary crossing become a boundary violation? Or is a dual relationship always harmful? Or are there times when it would be okay and understandable and even helpful under certain conditions? And what are those conditions? And what kinds of situations might um, define a dual relationship as something that could be beneficial or therapeutic or helpful? Um, I don't think we could spend time talking about boundaries without really looking at the impact of the internet and social media on professional boundaries. This could be an entire day's training, just saying it's not my super expertise. Frederick Reamer has written a great deal about social media and about the impact of the internet on professional boundaries, but I just at least want to touch on it to get us kind of thinking about what some of those issues and challenges and opportunities might be in that look at where we're meeting today. We're in a virtual world. Um, so how does this impact our experience and our clients' and constituents' experiences of boundaries? Um, Several of you have put in the chat the role of self-disclosure in boundary management. I've trained in self-disclosure, and I think again, back in the old days, it was like you were like this blank slate, like really, like you can't read me in terms of making assumptions about gender, age, gender expression, sexual orientation, what have you. So this idea of how do we think about self-disclosure in useful or potentially not useful ways in boundary management? How do we keep it in a client or constituent-centered way when we're saying something about ourselves or displaying something about ourselves or living our lives out in the world? And by just doing that, we're making a statement in terms of some kind of self-disclosure. Um, we're going to be looking throughout in terms of power and oppression and ethical boundary considerations. And power is critically important in all aspects of decision making. So we'll explore a couple of ways of looking at power and how that influences and impacts managing boundary issues in our relationships within communities and within our clinical relationships, maybe our personal lives. So we'll look at a couple of different models, the liberation health model and the power analysis model that comes out of the Wellesley College. We won't be able to get into depth about that, but I want to at least reference a few different ways of thinking about kind of analyzing and using our awareness of power dynamics to help with ethical decision making. And then we're going to close out the day with the day. It's only 2 hours, but feels like a day's worth of work here, maybe many days worth of work here. But we're going to close out the day with looking at a vignette and applying some elements of a decision-making toolkit that comes out of the work of Reich, and we're going to wrap it up. So hopefully that will touch on some or all or in part of what you're hoping for and needing from our time today. Um, so moving on. So, you know, I think it was often said that if Bill Clinton said it's about the economy stupid, I won't use the word stupid, I'll say it's about the relationship. And it's really critically important that we think about what it means in terms of boundary management and how important our relationship is to clients and constituents and how important it is. It's our responsibility to maintain that relationship, to maintain that frame. And I don't think it needs to be done in a rigid or constrictive kind of way. But, when we think about the relationship, there's a body of research called Common Factors Research, Common Factors. And it looks at what are the elements of change that are really critical in positive outcomes in treatment. And the treatment model actually represents a very small percentage of what helps, what contributes to positive outcomes. It's not that the treatment approach we use, whether it's cognitive behavioral, trauma-focused, internal family systems, it's not that it's not relevant, but the thing that is central and core to the improvement that we see in clients is hold on to your hats, the treatment relationship. And that when we think about the power of that for helping catalyze change within our clients and our communities, it just becomes all that more important that we try to maintain a scrupulous awareness of boundaries and how that can influence a positive outcome, how can it contribute to building a strong relationship, fostering hope, how it can speak to the credibility of our profession, and how powerful it is when we sometimes will have clients who come to us for whom a boundary was crossed, if not violated, by a person in power, be it a therapist, a physician, a teacher, a parent, some other individual who had a great deal of power over their lives. So again, thinking about holding the centrality and core of the relationship and having that foremost in mind is really critical to being able to understand how do we move forward in boundaries and boundary management in the most helpful way. So here are a couple of very quick examples that provide an opportunity to reflect a little bit on, well, what is it we're seeing here? So I'll just read this. Very common. Maria, clinical social worker at a large hospital, recently began treatment for breast cancer. Seeking emotional support, she joined an online cancer support group. During a virtual meeting, she was startled to recognize one of the participants, Jasmine, a former patient from the hospital's oncology unit. As the group shared deeply personal experiences, Maria struggled with the ethical dilemma of maintaining her own need for support while upholding professional boundaries. She worried about her presence in the group and how that might affect Jasmine's comfort, confidentiality, and perception of their professional relationship, raising concerns about dual relationships and boundary crossings in an emotionally charged setting. So I think this we won't spend a great deal of time analyzing this case. We'll come back to a number of short vignettes. But again, I think you can see where it begins to raise a tension between upholding an ethical standard of confidentiality and yet upholding our need for connection, for care. Now, we may be in a large urban setting, or we may be in a fairly rural setting. We may be in places that treatment options are inaccessible or very difficult to get. And then we're faced with a challenging decision about how to uphold our ethical principles, at the same time, how to benefit from the experience, and how the presence of a former patient, somebody with whom we'd had interactions on their unit, how might that affect or impact our experience of the group? What might we shade or do differently, knowing there's somebody there with whom we had that kind of relationship? No answers at this point, but just to kind of highlight some of the common dilemmas where the personal and professional boundaries intersect. Here's another one. David, a licensed clinical social worker, had been attending services at Unitarian Universalist Church for several years, drawn to its inclusive and affirming community. One Sunday after the service, a fellow congregant, Lisa, approached him with a request. She shared that her 15-year-old child, Alex, was exploring their gender identity and considering transitioning. Knowing that David was both a social worker and an advocate for LGBTQ issues, Lisa asked if he would be willing to see Alex for counseling. Full disclosure, this actually happened to me. It wasn't a kid necessarily, but wanting to know if I'd be willing to see them as a client. And wanting to be inclusive and thoughtful and generous. I'm like, and part of me is like, sure. And another part of me is like, oh no, no. What what would that mean for them when suddenly we're crossing each other in services, we're sharing committees, we're in worship, we're attending an event or even a coffee, or how would that begin to change and shape our relationship, the nature of confidentiality? What would it feel like for me to be a little bit selfish? You're thinking, how would I manage that in this setting? So I did have a conversation with the person, and I said, I think it might be probably creating a bit of a boundary challenge for either of us, and what might they be like? And let me think about a person I could refer you to. So I don't know if it was the best solution, but it's the best one I could come up with at that time. In terms of, again, dealing with the intersection of our personal lives in places where we will encounter people with whom we've had a professional engagement in a relationship. So these may be questions that come up at times, which is, do should you ever touch a client, and if so, under what circumstances? Should you ever date a former client or develop a friendship with one? Do you accept gifts from a client or hire them to do work for you? What about getting investment advice from a client or going into business with one? How do boundaries and macro practice differ than the boundaries many of us perhaps are trained with, which really more often privilege the clinical or direct service relationship? So, no answers to any of those yet. We will get to them. I guess the question for me then is, how do you and how do we define boundaries in social work practice? So, think about that for a moment. What do we mean? What do we think of when we think of boundaries? And how does it connect to being in a professional relationship? The essence of being a good social worker lies in the relationships we make with our clients, with our colleagues, agencies, and communities. And it also obliges us in terms of how we safeguard them. So we do have codes of ethics. We do have various ways of thinking about from trainings like this, right through to sanctions from licensing boards. We hopefully will gain more traction earlier on when people use consultation with colleagues, with supervisors, with others to really identify what is the nature of an ethical dilemma, which we'll talk about. But the nature of an ethical dilemma is when it feels like two or more cherished values are bumping up against each other. And as Rick Riemer might often say, when neither option feels right. So sometimes we feel like we're picking the least bad of several different options. But I hopefully will think about ways that we can frame it in more positive terms as time goes on. But the core, again, lies in the relationship. And going back in time, the idea of a human relationship and the value of the relationship goes back decades and decades in the very first textbooks written about social work practice. It's also the core of card books we use by authors such as Hepworth, Rooney, and Larson, where again, the core, the relationship, the skills of engagement are paramount. So, so I scroll through these. All right. So, some of you may be familiar with this term, fiduciary, from the law, and you're like, wait, what? What does it have to do with social work? In fact, it has quite a lot to do with social work, and I explained how momentarily. It does come from the law. Its Latin roots, fiducia, refer to trust or confidence. So it's applicable to us as well because it involves the trust and confidence people place in our hands in a professional relationship or in a particular transaction. So when I go to the surgeon, I have a broken ankle, I trust and hope that they know what they're doing and will do right by me and serve me honorably and have the skills to do so as advertised. So trust is an important dimension of a professional relationship. And, when you see trust in professions, when you see trust in science, when you see trust in those who are trained to be helpful and have the skills, where we find ourselves in a tough place. So um, again, the fiduciary responsibility we have is to hold the relationship and hold a place of trust and accountability and credibility with regard to our clients. But there are some challenges to this, and I'll identify a few. One is that when you think about and we think about professional life, one of the values that we very much hold dearly is autonomy, the ability to make decisions over our environment and over our caseload. And as many of you experience, as we see over time, sometimes we have limited autonomy and limited control over decisions that impact client lives and constituents' lives. So, in a sense, we're kind of freighted with it. I don't want to use that word, but we're holding a responsibility as a fiduciary to do what's best for clients, but we're also working with multiple systems and in multiple ways where we may have less control over that than we would like. We may not have direct control as to when a patient's discharged from an inpatient unit. We might leverage our advocacy skills, and in that sense, we're upholding the fiduciary responsibility, holding that boundary as a client would expect us and hope for us to be able to advocate on their behalf. And yet we have responsibility to the institution, to the place that pays our bills, or pays the salary so we can pay our bills. So again, there's some challenges to what it means to uphold that relationship in terms of fluidity, in terms of what do we describe as what is a professional relationship? What does that look like? What are the parameters of that? There's a whole science and sociology about the science of professions. Um, how do we manage situations in which we are bound to different kinds of fiduciary responsibilities towards people with whom we interact, where there's a mandated responsibility which we have to uphold along with our the importance of the client relationship. And many of us, as many times, have managed these quite often. And finally, advocating with an oppressive system. So again, how do we uphold that relationship within systems that may, in and of themselves, be unethical? I hope there aren't many of those, or larger systems whereby we are, again, placed in a position where This is what I would do in the ideal world. This is how I would uphold my responsibility and the boundary to provide competent care. And here's some things we have to grapple with. So, so having said all that, and using the word fiduciary in a sentence, how do you define professional boundaries in social work? So I'm going to invite you to pop in just the first thing comes to mind in the chat. When you think about professional boundaries in social work, what comes to mind? Consider the role in ethical practice, in our client relationships, and maintaining trust. So just first thing comes to mind when you even heard of this workshop about boundaries, what comes to mind? Could be a judgment, positive, negative. I think of them as rigid. I think of them as helpful. I think of them as necessary. I'm not sure. So, so I invite you just to pop a few of those thoughts and responses in the chat, and let's see. Professionalism while being authentic, do no harm, maintaining one-way therapeutic relationship, explanation of the purpose in oops, our given role. Thank you. Centering clients' well-being, authenticity with a filter. I love that. That could be the name of my next workshop. Authenticity with a filter. Client and worker safety, again, do no harm, avoiding personal involvement. Excellent. Let's just pick a few more. Safety and predictability. Again, I think that that speaks to that fiduciary responsibility of informed consent, defining and realizing and manifesting safety within the relationship. Uh, Excellent. Good. Safety and privacy. Awesome. Thank you. Well, here's one ethics expert, Alan Barsky, and he defines boundaries in this way, which is kind of interesting. It's this invisible line of demarcation, sorry, swapping around my image here, between the client and the social worker, which determines appropriate roles and boundaries between them. I like that idea of kind of this invisible line of demarcation. Um, it may not be something we can see, but we sure know when it gets crossed. We sure know when we see it, and we sure know its importance. So again, thinking about boundaries as a framework for ethical decision making. So it isn't all about boundaries, but it sure is a framework for thinking about how to maintain that frame. So, for example, you know, there are so many dilemmas that we encounter in our work, sometimes every day. And the need for boundaries is important in fulfilling an ethical decision and addressing an ethical challenge. And that's an understanding of our role. And that sounds pretty basic, but what is our role within the organization? What is our role with regard to the client's expectations for the work we're doing together? So clarity about our role is really critical in being able to address a dual relationship or potential conflict of interest. What are clients, what can they expect of us? How do we apprise them in our informed consent in ways that uphold self-determination, what they can and cannot expect from us? So having a role clarity is really essential in defining boundaries and what uh, largely can be considered coloring within or outside the lines of those boundaries. And if we're coloring outside of those lines, why and what is the meaning of it? And what are the reasons for these exceptions? So clarity is great. Knowing what our role is super. Balancing care with our ethical obligations. But there may be other considerations too, which is that the lines of demarcation around our boundaries and our professional responsibilities can sometimes be challenging. Like, for example, um, the digital divide. Can we say that um, with cultural issues that are important for us to understand and to demarcate our boundaries in ways that our clients may find disrespectful? For example, providing small gifts, food, ways of honoring your work and creating equity within the relationship may be really important. Um, and also how we respond to each other in these digital spaces. So we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the digital divide when we can assume that there are some folks who will not have bandwidth or the opportunity to engage in virtual counseling. And what does it mean when people can look into our homes, we can look into theirs? And what does that mean in terms of creating boundaries or helping them reinforce boundaries when there may be no privacy in the environment in which they live? They may be speaking and they may be heard by an abusive spouse or child or another family member. So again, I think it's lovely to think in an abstract way about upholding these boundaries in ways that really kind of hold that frame. But it's also really important to think about what are some of the exceptions. And certainly this came up a whole lot during the pandemic. We were suddenly all thrown into the online environments, and there were situations where you just really couldn't be quite sure, or even the questions I'm asking undermining someone's safety, let alone their confidentiality and right to self-determination. Um, at the same time, two former colleagues of mine from Simmons College of Social Work, Simmons University now of Social Work, Stefan Krug and Sophie Freud wrote about the sense in which many of the ways in which boundaries are defined and the ways in which the Code of Ethics defines them tend to really privilege the clinical relationship. And this is not news to many of you who are in community-based practice, but that it's so often it says, well, we're the instructional guide for the profession, but um, is the framework really more geared toward the clinical relationship? And so, when we think about boundaries, when we think about the settings and contexts in which we engage with our clients, are they all the same? Are we supposed to observe in exactly the same way, irrespective of the context or the agency or the culture or the community? I think not. But then how do we make discernments about where and how and under what conditions we would change that? So, as promised, we're going to take a look at what are the distinctions between these three terms, these areas that are overlapping and have some very distinct elements as well. Boundary crossings, boundary violations, and dual relationships. See that? Yes, I'm sensing you may still be having some boundary issues. There it is. I felt like that. Just stay away. Don't come near me. Yep, setting a boundary. Um, so here's one definition from Barsky among other colleagues and ethics um, experts within social work. A boundary crossing occurs when a social worker intentionally or unintentionally deviates from traditional professional boundaries or from their characteristic roles and behaviors in a way that may be beneficial or neutral to the client. These actions do not necessarily harm the client, but require careful ethical consideration. Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. And I can share with you that I have a former client who lives right in back of my house. And I didn't know this when they moved in. They didn't know that I lived here, but very soon we discovered that we lived maybe 100 feet apart. And immediately I'm thinking, oh my gosh, like, can they hear me being a parent, not at my highest level? Can we put it that way? And what does that mean when I can hear them? And how, so we were no longer involved in a relationship, but we were clearly in a situation where we lived in the same neighborhood. I see former clients walk by my house. They know where I live. They see me. I mean, so sometimes it's not a disclosure like I'm telling you something, but it is the reality of living in the world, whether you're living in an urban environment or rural community. Even in large urban environments, there are nested communities within larger communities. So if you're a member of the LGBTQ community, if you're a member of another group that comes together for mutual aid, mutual support, it may largely be your experience, if not once, multiple times, that we just find ourselves in the same space. People in recovery often speak about what it's like as social workers, as mental health professionals, when attending meetings with people who are in recovery, whom they also see in their practice. So Um, it is just the reality, the world in which we live, that unless we're choosing to live in a bubble, I do not, that we need to be prepared for these kind of situations. And so, oftentimes with students and as people entering the field, you might have that rehearsal conversation about what will happen if we bump into each other at the store, or da 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 da. I'll never come by to say hello to you, but you're welcome to say hello to me, da da da. So, I mean, just I'm sure you all know how to have these conversations, but there are times when, I'm at a store and I'm disciplining my kid. I'm like, this is not my higher parenting moment. Or maybe other times when you just feel like, oh my goodness, like suddenly my behavior is shaped by the realization.
Defense office, this is Kelly. How can I help you? Sure.
Yeah,
And
sorry, I
this
think
is you. You should
somebody
hear her.
unmuted a bit. Sorry about that. Thank you. So again, I provided some in vivo examples of boundary crossings, but there may be some in which it is an intentional boundary crossing. So attending a client's graduation. Um, I actually some years ago attended a client's wedding. And it was, I think, perfectly understandable within the context of their lives why they would want me to attend this event. Had known them for a number of years, had seen them through a number of changes and difficult relationships, but it took a lot of careful planning. Like, okay, I'm going to go to the wedding ceremony, but not the reception. We'll come in at the end, not at the end. So we really kind of choreographed this in a way that was really intentional and very thoughtful. We weighed the pros and cons. It was not an easy decision that we came to, but it felt like the right decision. So accepting small gifts. So again, assessing whether this boundary crossing, or in the case of the decision we might make to step out of our offices or out of the settings in which we visit or see our clients, and how would it be defensible in terms of minimizing risk and maximizing benefit? Um, some ethics scholars talk about the idea of like if it's done with proper intent, you know, well, that's great. We hope it would be with proper intent, but proper intent has a little vibe of like, well, I didn't mean to. Like, well, but you did. So proper intent alone may not be enough. If the worker has client-centered intentions, they need to ask whose interests are truly being served, and how could a boundary crossing become a boundary violation? So going back to my example of the wedding, imagine going to the reception and you're approached by somebody like, oh, so how do you know so and so? Um, And how do you protect that relationship in a way that doesn't feel really weird or awkward, but could commit an inadvertent boundary violation? If something would slip out, well, you said you worked together, but da 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 da, and so like, please go away. Um, but so thinking about and planning for those things ahead of times in which good intentions can go bad without thoughtful planning to how can this um, violate the spirit in which these actions were intended. Um, And so, again, being very thoughtful about agency policies, being very clear about what policies are and when you're stepping out of that, what could be the ramifications in terms of implications for the agency, for liability, and so forth. So, we're going to call this a brief foray into some gray areas around boundary issues and the internet and social media. Um, so, Here's another question for the group. So feel free to pop your responses in the chat. Um, Social media and digital communications become integral understatement to our personal and professional lives. What challenges have you encountered or do you anticipate encountering when trying to uphold ethical boundaries in social media and other platforms? So feel free to address any challenges you've encountered, and also any particular opportunities or ways in which you think it has animated or improved relationships. But so just take a moment, cogitate on the question, and throw a few things into the chat in terms of any challenges that you've experienced. Receiving friend requests on Facebook, um, the challenge of maintaining anonymity while also trying to build community, um, clients finding a social media profile. Yes, yes. Other challenges? A care manager, elder services. A lot of consumers would rather text than talk. Oh yes, 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 yes. We'll talk about that. Being involved in a common thread in a friend's post, and a friend that the friend of a friend is a client also involved in the thread. Yeah, it's like, oh, what did I say here? Would I want my client my worst day to know what we said? Being involved in a common post. Not experienced anything like that so far. I can imagine people trying to connect in social media. Um, Changing names in Facebook. Yes. Social media disclosure with the understanding clients might find them and make decisions about their care. That's excellent point based on these assumptions or what people post. Right. Fantastic. Thank you. Realizing some staff don't want other staff having their personal phone number. Oh, yeah. So in and among and between staff, how to manage boundaries between and among care managers, case managers. That very interesting. Right. So we'll talk about boundaries as they impact relationships not only between worker and client or constituency or group, but among and between staff. So some of the questions I think that have already come up in the chat are ones, again, we don't have any clear answers, so we have some ideas and some guidelines. Is it ever ethically appropriate for a social worker and a client to share a group social media site? It may be done inadvertently, like I said, a person responds to a thread and then they forward you, they like you, they friend request you. So again, thinking about what that might mean and having hopefully a conversation with the person, um, and the implications of that. So again, we don't need to feel put on the spot. I think there's always an importance to consultation. What do we think about that? And then your own personal choice to respect your own boundaries, your own right to privacy. You're human beings too, and we need and we want to be able to maintain a sense of privacy. So making sure you're familiar with the settings and how to do that in a way. Um, just providing services electronically, messaging, emailing outside of scheduled appointments create an enhanced ethical risk. Um, the answer is maybe. It depends on how you have crafted your informed consent in understanding, as I think most often is the case, that texting is not a time to tell people or tell your clinician, tell your worker or case manager a long soliloquy about a relationship breakup or about your depression. It's really a time to manage appointments. But nevertheless, people will still send very long text messages, and again with a reminder that it's not HIPAA compliant, and these are potentially open to anyone who would want to have access to that information. So I might just say, response to like 5 miles of text, thank you. I look forward to seeing you on Thursday. And sometimes get a little pissed off, like, why do you remember we had the conversation about responding to text messages? So again, outside of your protected HIPAA compliant platforms, um, yes, we don't want to help. We don't want to create ethical risk by responding in. I mean, this is again very basic, but still, nevertheless, it can put us on the spot, and it can feel like what we're doing is setting a boundary that can feel harsh, or we're declining to connect with them. We don't want to respond to the friend request. It's all again done within the context of what's the relationship and how do we make that part of the conversation. Does the social worker trespass professional boundaries if they search for personal information about a client to clarify ambiguities in their background? Um, I admit, maybe once or twice in my life, I have searched for client and I felt immediate regret about it because Um, it really it really undermined their sense of confidentiality, and informed consent. They didn't consent to my going online and doing a Google search of them or their background. They did not provide consent. So it tends to violate our fiduciary responsibility in trust in that when we tell them how we'll work with them, it's based on the information they share with us or the information they give us permission to in terms of engaging collaterals. It wasn't to like check up on like, who are they dating, who are they? I mean, I we don't do that, but sometimes we just have this intense curiosity. And I think what we need to really think about is, well, how then do we use that information if it didn't come up in the context of a conversation. And then that gets into a whole nother domain of boundary crossings and boundary violations is in the realm of secrecy. So now I have this information that I'm withholding from you that I learned from looking at social media, from Googling you. I know that you had this encounter that landed you in prison, and my God, that never came up in our work. And what do I do with this information? So it really undermines a sense of the integrity of the profession and authenticity because now we have the secret and now we can't share it because to do so would reveal ourselves as having snooped in ways that they never gave permission to. So I think we can say the answer is, despite the intense curiosity we might feel occasionally to do it, better not to. And then to what extent does a social worker violate ethical obligations if we engage in self-disclosure to build rapport with clients? And I know several of you um, in the chat at the beginning talked about self-disclosure. I've done trainings on it. It's a very interesting and compelling topic. So we'll address it a little bit, going beyond technology and social media, but really, as we finish up this session, we'll talk about what do we mean by self-disclosure. So, should social workers follow clients on social media? Probably not, because again, it creates a dual relationship and can comprise professional boundaries. So, in what role are we engaging with people in social media? Are we in our jurisdiction considered licensed social worker 24/7? So, in one jurisdiction, if you witness a client engaging in behavior that might require mandated reporting, even though you're, quote, off the clock, in some jurisdictions, it doesn't matter. You're always a mandated reporter. In others, you're not. So I think, again, understanding the nature of the licensing in your jurisdiction, what it means to be, on the clock or off the clock. For me, I feel like in terms of my client relationships, as long as I've ever had a professional relationship with them, I don't think it's ever a point when I can be like, okay, that was then, and now we'll pursue this kind of new thing. Um, Digital footprints matter. Again, we've already spoken about the cyber snooping, and it can feel tempting, but again, the compromising of privacy and informed consent. Again, thinking before you post, I'm sure we all do, but who might have access to that? Have we checked the privacy settings, whatever. And then the idea of, again, confidentiality is non-negotiable and really being able to have conversations with the clients about the risks that they run by emailing or texting us long soliloquies outside of the HIPAA-protected sites that we might use. So there are a few thoughts about self-disclosure, when to use it, how to use it, what are some of the limits, and again, we're thinking about what is a good intent. Good intent may not be enough, but it may be a good start. So is it meant to strengthen the therapeutic relationship or our constituents' relationship or understanding of our lived experience? Because perhaps lived experience would be really relevant for people who are in recovery. The question may come up, are you in recovery? Have you experienced trauma? In what level of depth do we feel compelled or obliged to disclose? And where are the boundaries of our own privacy? So we come up with this lot, not only in terms of what we disclose, but what people might ask us. And in some cultural backgrounds or in 12-step culture, self-disclosure is a critical component to building a sense of trust and connection. Are you a parent? Can you get where I'm coming from? So sometimes it may be initiated by our client or constituent. Other times it may be initiated by us. And if it's us who's doing the initiating and thinking, why? So it can blur the professional client boundary. And I don't mean for these things to sound so rigid, but if I'm sharing with somebody, oh, I went to that restaurant too. Okay. The chances are probably pretty okay that we're not going to damage a relationship. But oh, I had surgery like that too. Or remember when I went through a depression. Oh, okay. So maybe that's a compelling reason why you might want to share that part of your history. But what does it again do when the client says, "Oh, I'm so sorry you went through that"? And what does that then send in terms of an internalized message, which could be, wow, my therapist is so cool. My social worker is really like very self-disclosing, and I felt like they really get me. Or what if it happens again? Can they be there for me? Can I trust that I don't need to take care of them? Because that's what I was obliged to do as a kid. And I don't want to be in a relationship with somebody that I feel like I need to take care of. So if it has the risk of shifting the focus away from client needs, if your in-depth knowledge about the person, about their history, suggests that there's a possibility that they may feel the need to take care of you, then we're in a bit of a quagmire. And it's not, it's not like uh, an irreparable harm. It may be like, oh, let's talk about that. Let's talk about how that landed with you and what we might need to do to refocus on you, which is the reason we're here. So ensuring that the self-disclosure is intentional, client-centered, and ethically sound. Personally, I think there are a whole bunch of tools in that toolkit that we can use before we need to use self-disclosure, to be honest. It can be kind of a down the line thing, and it can be helpful, but what else have we tried? What else have we felt like we could use to leverage authenticity in the relationship, beneficial relationship, in the sense of us in our respective roles, holding professional boundaries, but in a way that feels real and authentic to people. And I don't think we have to say, oh, yeah, I went through that too, for people to get that. In fact, I don't think that people really want to know necessarily, do you have kids? Or are you in recovery with that? They want to know, right? I mean, do you get me? And you centering my experience and our time together. So, in sum, returning to the theme of boundary crossings, all kinds of boundary crossings in all kinds of ways, intentional, unintentional, involving sharing information, being asked information, things that get posted in social media. So you get the idea there are a lot of ways in which boundaries can blur and be crossed. So they can be beneficial, but they require ethical consideration as even well-intended actions that may blur professional boundaries or create risks, particularly for marginalized clients who may experience power imbalances. So if you're sharing this thing from a position of privilege, like, oh, I know how hard it can be to find appropriate childcare. Well, but you have a spouse, you have access to resources, and you're not dependent on more. So you kind of get the idea, like, we can't assume that the sharing is going to be relayed or understood in a way that doesn't really more announce privilege rather than empathy. Social media adds new challenges, raising questions about online interactions, self-disclosure, client privacy, which can disproportionately impact clients with limited digital access or heightened surveillance. Policies, as emphasized by Reamer, must maintain ethical standards, but also address systemic inequities and access and privacy. Self-disclosure finally can foster trust, but must be used carefully to avoid shifting the focus from the client, reinforcing privilege dynamics or compromising professionalism. I know that's a mouthful, but hopefully just to kind of give us a sense to reflect on and think about ways in which these boundary crossings are really anything but simple and how they can really slip into this next area of a conversation, which is about boundary violations. So we'll get into this for a bit, maybe 5 or 6 minutes, and then we'll take a brief break and we'll come back. But for now, we'll introduce this topic. Um, According to Reamer, among others, a boundary violation occurs when a social worker breaches professional ethics, often leading to harm and exploitation of the client or constituent. These violations comprise professional objectivity, create conflicts of interest, or result in emotional, financial, or physical harm to the client. So there are generally kind of four types of ways to think about, or four kind of categories of boundary issues beyond the obvious transgressions, which we'll talk about shortly regarding intimate or sexual contact with the client. There are things like, well, there boundary violations occur between worker and client and constituent. There can be boundary violations and boundary issues that are crossed with colleagues, with their agencies, and within the larger community. So I think most often we think in terms of micro clinical practice. Boundary violations can be um, In exchange for a gift, we might say, uh, there might be the sense of like, well, uh, um, do I owe this client? No, let me put this another way. Um, the sense that we may find a client has skills and tools that are useful for us. In fact, they might be a really great spokesperson, or in fact, they would be a really great example of somebody I could put in this vignette that I want to write about. So, in whose interest is that request serving? It would be in the interest of the worker or the author. And how freely does a client have the right to say no? Say no could mean, will you deny me care, deny me services? Will you not like me as much? Will you be mad at me? So the asking of a question, even the idea of like, oh, um, I'm having some plumbing issues. I know you have some background in that. Can I just ask you for a real quick referral? Right then, there's something that's being crossed because suddenly the session shifts, the meeting shifts into something that's for my benefit. And believe me, I've been tempted to ask people who have backgrounds in contracting, where do you find a decent contractor? But no, not about me. It's about them. It can occur with and between and among colleagues. So when a worker, clinician, a case manager develops a close relationship with their supervisor, and something happens, an infraction occurs, and the supervisor feels a sense of um, care for the worker to the point that if they may even choose to withhold certain kinds of information that could be considered compromising for the worker. And so, will the person who might have been deserved to the worker's actions or inactions, will they get a fair deal if we're protecting our relationship with our supervisee or colleague or friend? Um, can boundary violations occur within agencies and places of employment? In some cases, sadly, yes. Situations where people may be asked to commit insurance or billing fraud. It's not common, but it is not unusual. And what does that do in terms of putting us at the crosshairs of professional boundary between our connection to the law, um, to our agency, to our bill collectors and bill payers, the people we owe responsibility to, and upholding ethical standards, which is like, we can't do this. And what does it really take to address issues within a place of employment? And then finally, within the larger community, sort of who are we in the larger community? What are the things that can breach a sense of our role and responsibilities if we begin to blur boundaries or cross boundaries with community organizations with which we work, if we're double dipping in terms of funding streams and funding sources? So there are any of a number of ways that we could slip slide into problematic areas with regard to boundary crossings. Um, what I want to move to is what many of us may have heard or learned, been told, or seen. Um, Gosh, I'm thinking about the TV series In Treatment. The actor Gabriel Byrne plays a psychiatrist who develops a romantic and sexual connection with a female client or patient or an adolescent or whatever of theirs. And the havoc that that wreaks, I think, was just demonstrated so powerfully and dramatically. So sexual relationships and dual relationships as dual relationships are always harmful. And I'd be willing to engage in a conversation about ways in which people can think they're not, but it's really hard to see how they don't powerfully um, and harmfully impact um, our client population. So, for example, it can contribute to things like a power imbalance. Do we really feel like it's an equal relationship between the worker and the client? And I know for a period of time, it's going back a number of years, colleagues who I knew of, who, under the auspices of having an egalitarian relationship with their clients, felt it was appropriate, if not beneficial, to engage in an intimate partnership with them because we're all on an equal playing field. And it was a really unfortunate kind of dynamic that was created because it acknowledged power in a way that really advantaged the worker, but not so much the client. So they created and erected a whole series of justifications using various theory, feminist theory, among others, to poo-poo the idea of being a power imbalance as an egalitarian relationship, but it wasn't. It wasn't until that worker had shared everything with that person that the client shared with them. It is not the same. The issues of transference, we know in the work we do, we don't have to be psychodynamically oriented to know the power of who we as the worker, the case manager, the supervisor, who we can represent. And it can be powerful attachment figures. It can be a parent. It could be a former spouse. It could be any of a number of kind of templates of important attachment figures from our lives. And if the worker exploits that, it can further erode or damage trust in other kinds of relationships with people in positions of power.
For CBHC Academy,
Oh,
I linked some of the original planning materials and
oh.
information because
Hi. Somebody is off. If you could mute yourself, please. Thank you.
nobody
Um,
sent it would have been.
Thank you. I know it's so easy to kind of unmute and suddenly we're like, oh my God, people are hearing me talk about all this stuff. So again, thinking in terms of power of transference or the importance of that relationship and what it can do to their future in building any kind of trusting relationships with any sort of figures in terms of also the power of an intimate partnership, the power of that connection with another human being. And so the implications are, vast. Um, So the range in harms can lead to a number of different challenges, including legal consequences. Currently, at this point, um, all 50 states will have legal sanctions, so it can be a devastating uh, impact on career. But it doesn't mean that having and feeling a sense of attraction to or with a client is a deal breaker. It could be, but it doesn't have to signal the end of a relationship. So I think that sometimes we do a very poor job in providing an opportunity for people to feel like they can describe or discuss feelings of attraction that they may have had for somebody with whom they work in a way that doesn't make them feel like they're going to be judged or fired or pathologized. And unfortunately, that ethos or that belief system can drive underground the conflict that can then escalate its intensity. So again, it may not be like, hey, how are you dealing? I mean, we don't want to do this in a casual way, but we want to create an environment, foster a setting in which our supervision provides an opportunity for people to deal with complex transient and countertransferential issues. Among them can be feelings of attraction. And when we need to act and when we need to know it at a certain point in time, I don't think I can work with this person. And there may be a number of other reasons why we maybe hold a boundary that may relate to our scope of practice, our areas of competence. We might have to say, I don't feel like I can work with this person for these reasons. And we provide transition care. We don't abandon the client, which is another violation of boundaries. We can't just say bye. Nobody here would, I know that. But again, to be able to find a space where we can ourselves deal with our own issues of self-care, our own feelings related to being overburdened and burned out. That's a whole nother area of conversation. But when we begin to feel like we could potentially cross a line, what is that saying? What does that mean in terms of how are we managing our own personal boundaries and our own self-care, as the code of ethics would remind us of? But what does that really mean? Are we provided opportunities through our places of employment or in our lives to take that necessary time to engage in radical self-care or any self-care? So, I just want to finish this before we take a little break. So, Reich and colleagues asked the question, well, what constitutes a quote client? I think we all maybe think we know what that means from our work, but when and how and under what conditions do we think about who is a client? The Code of Ethics is quite clear about engaging in sexual activities, contact with former clients, because if such work is engaged, it's contrary to this prohibition or claim that an exception to this prohibition is warranted because of extraordinary circumstances, it's the social workers and not their client who are responsible for justifying the courses of action, whether intentional or unintentional. Okay, let's take a moment and unpack that. I mean, so is a client the same whether we're working within a job training program, um, whether it's somebody we have seen in a community group in a neighborhood, whether it's somebody we have worked with as a case manager, or somebody we have done years worth of psychotherapy. Should, it's just a question, should we be treating every client as if they're one monolithic entity and treating them under every condition as if the impact of any kind of sexual or intimate involvement will be damaging? I would say let's be on the safe side because there's some things even about this admonition that are really kind of concerning, I think, and we should all be concerned, which is there's still a power dynamic, whether or not it's a current or former client situation. So when does a professional relationship end? Is it at the point of termination? Or is there some connection that people have with us to go beyond when the agency terminated, when they were discharged from our care? And I think about the person I had seen for therapy, self-disclosure time, and I was like, if I wanted to come back in 3 or 4 years, I want to know that that person is still holding that frame so we can return to that work together rather than embarked on a different kind of collegial or social relationship. So again, thinking about the structural location and power issues involved, like what does it mean to say, well, we as social workers are justified, I have to justify the action. Well, who has the power in this? Do people have the power to say no, given our social location, the power of our relationship? And moreover, what are the potential legal and professional repercussions? Like, what does it mean when it says it's warranted because of the what an extraordinary like what's an extraordinary circumstance that would require us to engage in an intimate relationship with a former client or constituent? I don't know what that is, but it certainly seems like to be an ethically solid ground, even though it is rather shaky, we need to be able to justify what that means and to be able, I mean, it just feels so fraught and so complicated. Um, so lastly, the APA has a set of criteria that are a bit different than social work, which is that they view its amount of time since a person is a client. So there's a kind of period of time, maybe it's several years. I can't remember exactly what the number of years is. It has to do with the nature, duration, intensity of the relationship and the circumstances of termination. Was it voluntary? Was it collaborative? Was it we've done a piece of work? The history, current mental status, and so forth, and the likelihood or possibility of adverse consequences. So again, even though there's more latitude and flexibility, there's an awful lot to think about and an awful lot of ways in which this boundary crossing could become a boundary violation as it becomes a complex dual relationship. So, and with that, let's take, if we can take maybe a 4 minute stretch. It's 2:09, so we'll come back in about 4 minutes. At 2:14, I'll start yakking again. And in the meantime, if there are any concerns you want to throw into the chat, things you want to make sure we get to, feel free to take a moment to do that. Otherwise, take a walk, rehydrate, check in on your kids, your partner, whomever, your pets, and we'll see you back in 4 minutes. Yeah, yeah, thank you for that. Clients with whom there's grief, loss, yes. Um, Yeah, it's a really interesting one, Angela. Um, Grief and loss of clients asking if you've experienced the same type of loss. We may have, we may not have. And trying to find common humanity. Do we share in that experience? And at the same time, how do we hold a client-centeredness that doesn't put them in a position of feeling they need to provide us comfort? It's tricky because I think just the human interaction, the human response would be, I know what that's like. And maybe there's a way to engage in the conversation with, I know what that's like without saying, I lost a parent too, or I lost my partner several years ago. But yeah, I think yeah, excellent. So I'm just going to step off camera for about a minute, and then we'll see you all back in a couple of minutes. Right. Welcome back, everybody, now to the third category of this talk today, and that involves dual relationships. So, again, as before, um, just toss in the chat the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the term dual relationship. And what do you see as potential harms of dual relationships? Or, you know, perhaps dual relationships aren't necessarily harmful at all. So just take a minute and pause and think about what comes to mind when you think about or heard the term dual relationship, or if you can think of examples that may illustrate that, and just share with the chat, and then we'll move on. Tricky and sticky situations. I love the rhyme as well. Yes, tricky and sticky. Having a personal professional relationship with someone. Yes, very good. Intersection of work and personal life, which may not be intentional. Yes. Yeah. Supervision, need to share with other professionals and get guidance. Uh-huh. Anybody else? These are great. Competing priorities and interests. Yes. Needing something from a client. Absolutely. Can I get a good recommendation for a plumber? Ooh. Um, Competing priorities and interests. Good. Anything, anybody else? Overlapping parts of life that can either be innocuous or cause actual harm. Oh, just uncomfortable. Very good. Excellent. Really good. Really good comments. Unintentional vulnerability. Thank you. Oh, hi, Suzanne. I know that name. Um, all right. So, dual relationships. One definition is a dual relationship occurs when a social worker has multiple roles with a client beyond the professional relationship, which can create conflicts of interest and impact objectivity. So, if unattended to, the needs of the client may no longer be the exclusive central focus of the relationship. And it could be very complicated, dual relationship in terms of multiple roles we're assuming, or it could be a dual relationship even in just that 1 second when I'm asking something that pertains to an interest of mine, not theirs. Now, I don't mean to be rigid about this because, like, you know, how is the restaurant versus, you know, can you clean my house? Very different kinds of things. So again, I want to reinforce this whole conversation with it. It doesn't need to be approached with a sense of trepidation and rigidity, but more, I would say, with a sense of intentionality. And if we're doing things that step out of the lines, what would the justification be if someone said, "Hey, why'd you do that? And how did this benefit the community, the group, or the client with which you're charged to care?" So, some experts among Bremer and others would say that not all dual relationships are necessarily unethical, but they have to be managed carefully to prevent conflicts of interest or harm the client. So, an example of a social dual relationship might be providing services with a friend. Um, I was in a very unintentional dual relationship when I realized that this man I've been seeing for therapy who started dating someone became abundantly clear that the person he was dating was one of my best friends. And I don't know how I knew that, but I just knew that because my best friend was also telling me about somebody that they were dating. And so, caught in the horns of a dilemma, which is you can't say anything to your friend is a violation of confidentiality. Um, Approaching this with a sense of thoughtfulness with regard to the client, um, one finds herself in a dual relationship that I unintentionally just found myself in. I'll be happy to come back later to tell you about how I handled it. It wasn't like what I would predict, but I'll just tell you now. So, I sat on this for about a session or visit or two, thinking, should I say to the client, I have a feeling, I mean, it wasn't like 100% sure, but it sure looked like it was the same person. And and thinking, well, if I said to the client, I think they might be dating a friend of mine, and then they go back to my friend, and he comes to me going, why didn't you tell me? Then we had this whole conversation we can't have. I mean, it's just messy, very, very messy. And I was paralyzed until one day when he came in, he said, I have a pretty good feeling that you're good friends with the person I'm dating. And yes, then we talked about it. We talked about what it would mean to have that. I wish I could say I had a much higher level interaction with him, but I found myself in the heels of this kind of dual relationship with him as my client, with the friend, and with this intersecting secret. So sometimes you just find yourselves in situations where the lines are not necessarily clear, but sometimes they are clear. Entering a business or financial dual relationship, hiring a client to do a job. We'll talk about this later when we talk about bartering, kinds of situations and relationships, and when is that ethically sound and indicated, and when is it not, and how do you know? Um, and familial and personal dual relationships, again, having a connection with somebody who is a family member of, and and so most often it might be, um, gosh, you were really helpful. Can I refer to a friend? And we might be like, well, what's the nature of the friendship? And is it possible that you might be talking about this client, maybe talking about you in the course of our work together versus a distant acquaintance, a coworker, or family member. So again, thinking through and carefully talking through before saying yes or no, what are the implications and how can we keep this client centered and what might be the response to maybe the worst possible outcome. So I want to read to you this vignette, which talks about a kind of a dual relationship, and then we can sort of chat briefly about any harms or benefits you might see here. So this is Malik, who was once a client at a nonprofit agency where he received support for overcoming housing instability. With the help of his social worker, Jordan, Malik secured stable housing and developed a passion for advocacy work. Years later, Malik completed a social work degree and was hired by the same nonprofit as a case manager. Now colleagues, Jordan and Malik occasionally cross paths in staff meetings and community events. Jordan is mindful to respect Malik's autonomy and growth, ensuring their previous therapeutic relationship does not affect their new professional dynamic. Malik appreciates that Jordan does not treat him as a former client, but as an equal in a shared mission to support others facing similar struggles. Okay. So I think that that might be a good example of a situation where um, you know, you inspired, in a sense, you inspire somebody with whom you work to become a social worker. And it can be a small world, especially if you share common interests or passions, or skill sets or toolkits that you may find yourself working within the same agency, within the same setting. And so, in this case, it seems to go well. There's a sense of an appreciation for them as a professional, not as a former client. Um, so let's take a look at another example. I'm sorry. No, that's the only one I had. Never mind. Um, Dynamics of power and oppression in addressing ethical boundaries in dual relationships. So I think we again attending to the issue of power across the board is critical. Structural and other forms of oppression in assessing and addressing ethical boundaries in these relationships. So social workers, we frequently engage with individuals and communities who experience marginalization, oppression, and structural inequalities. Because of these power imbalances, boundary violations such as exploitation, dual relationships, or conflict of interest can disproportionately harm clients from vulnerable backgrounds. So managing boundaries with an anti-oppressive lens ensures that we act as allies and advocates rather than perpetuating harm. So I want to just introduce you to some of the ways in which we can think about uh, community engagement and empowerment uh, within a liberation health model. For some of you who know the work of Don Belka Martinez, White, among others, we know the powerful ways in which the analysis based on the work of Paulo Freire and engaging people as their own agents starts with critically analyzing the structural and cultural issues involved that may be involved in this dual relationship with this dilemma faced by the client and faced by the worker. We need to assess whether this dual relationship might reinforce systemic oppression or, on the other hand, uphold white supremacy, elitism, marginalized communities. So really being able to think through and gain consultation about, well, this does feel like a dual relationship, but I feel on one hand, is there an opportunity for exploitation of a kind's vulnerability? Or on the other hand, if I hold a boundary, does it just come across as just feeling so elite and exclusive and disrespectful? Does this managing of dual relationships center on client community empowerment? Does it encourage reflexivity and collective accountability? So again, thinking even within the liberation health model, what is the worker's role and accountability in holding the frame for that relationship and recognizing and understanding the powerful dynamic? And finally, this liberation health model really does challenge and question sort of Western notions of professional boundaries, um, which is really worth noting. In some communities, in some cultures, the idea of this professional relationship that is only like managed within this 50-minute hour is really very like foreign, and that you may very well live within the community, may enjoy a cherished special role within the community, but you're not expected to sort of stand outside it. So thinking about how embedded these ideas are in notions of power, privilege, white supremacy culture, it's important in addressing any of these dilemmas with a sense of cultural humility. What do I really understand about this person's community, this client, their background? How would one course of action be perceived? And what are the ways of addressing it that feel respectful, and helpful in acknowledging these forces? So we've often seen the sort of a liberation health triangle. This mixes it up a little bit, where we consider, again, I really encourage you to read up on the liberation health model, to go to websites. It's a very useful way to engage and help build empowering relationships with clients, especially to think through yourself, even if it's not with your client or constituent, what are the what are the powerful what are the power factors here, and how could engaging in this particular kind of relationship help or harm the client or constituent community or group? So I know here we are. We have about a half hour left to go, and we want to be able to try and practice and identify what are some steps in resolving ethical dilemmas that entail some kind of a dual relationship. So we're going to work with this vignette for a good chunk of our time before we turn it over to another vignette and have you meet in breakout groups. So the vignette is as follows. Ayana, a social worker in a predominantly Black and Latinx neighborhood, facilitates a support group for mothers grieving the loss of loved ones to community violence. One of the group members, Marisol, a skilled hairstylist, offers Ayana a free hair appointment as a token of appreciation for her dedication. Aware that rigid professional boundaries may feel distant or unwelcoming in a close-knit community, Anna thoughtfully considers the ethical dilemmas this presents, trying to find a balance between professional integrity along with cultural sensitivity. So just hold that vignette in your mind. We don't know what you've done yet. So that's a bit of a cliffhanger here. So what we want to do is present a robust model of ethical decision making that can help think through in 6 steps. 5 and 6 are kind of blended, but certainly 1 through 5. What do we need to think about and do in order to arrive at a decision regarding an ethical upholding of the potential for a dual relationship? So we could do a whole nother training one day, just what's the essence of an ethical dilemma, and may be seen or described as competing values of importance. There may be more than two, maybe multiple competing values in which taking one path seems to obviate the other, and going this way can do the same to this. So how do we develop an integrated solution? Well, we need to do it, first of all, always in consultation, but identifying what are the ethical principles at stake. So we're not going to dive so much into the standards of the Code of Ethics today, but just thinking about the broad principles that uphold the beneficence of our profession, or certainly non-maleficence, not doing harm, doing no harm. What information do we need to gather to be able to come up with a decision to help us decide whether this is a particular dual relationship? Is it a dual relationship? And if it is, what are the potentials for harm? Again, that's number 3, identifying potential conflicts of interest and who may be harmed or who might benefit from this. To be able to analyze and understand the power and justice and cultural factors involved, leading to an exploration of possible courses of action. So that may be kind of brainstorming. In the course I teach in BU, we call it a harms analysis, really looking at, it's kind of like if any of you have done the decisional balance sheets in MI, the pros and cons of changing or keeping the same behavior. It's a little bit of like looking at methodically the pros and cons of different courses of action, and then finally making the decision and analyzing what the impact is. So I'm going to talk through with you a few of these examples with regard to this case vignette, and then we'll take you into small breakout groups, and then to apply this approach to another vignette. Okay. So again, my hope is at this point you have certainly, I think, enough familiarity with the code of ethics. You can identify the key principles of the code that follow through social justice and service, the client-centeredness, the dignity and worth of the individual, importance of human relationships, and these all derive from larger, broader principles of beneficence, non-maleficence, doing good and doing harm, doing justice, providing service. How do we support and uphold integrity and competence? So I wish we had more time to take a deeper dive into these, but just to pop them up here on the screen to be familiar with here are the important values and principles at stake, and sometimes they come into conflict with one another. So you might be thinking, well, what are some of the issues at play here in this vignette? And a few might be, maybe we're thinking about what are the justice issues involved? What can we do to avoid sort of rigid hierarchies and boundaries that diminish this idea of kind of mutual respect and mutual support? So justice can look like, how do we reduce the hierarchy while still upholding our fiduciary, remember the term, our fiduciary responsibility to doing best and doing what's good for the relationship? Um, how do we really encourage and uphold dignity and integrity and ensuring that Marisol in this vignette is being treated as an equal and active participant in decision making? So how do we uphold the dignity and integrity of their voice? And finally, how do we uphold the competence of the profession? Because many times decisions that we might make were down to things much beyond the parties who are directly involved, but can expand beyond to the community, to the agency, to the larger culture, to the profession itself. So thinking these certainly I think all of the other principles may be relevant, but when I think about this case, we might be thinking about what does justice look like here? What is dignity and integrity and competence that includes, if not cultural competence, cultural humility? What are the questions that need to be asked? So moving toward that, gathering essential information, um, which might look like, well, what are the details we need to understand about Marisol's situation? Um, what's the context? What's the need? What are the potential risks involved in accepting the kind offer for the appointment? Um, and what are our needs in terms of consultation with colleagues to really take a look at, well, what would it mean to say no? Or would it set up an inadvertent expectation? Like you do a home visit and they offer you food and you understand, and I don't know, Western culture or whatever, it would be insulting not to accept the food. And you do that even though you're like, oh, I'm vegan. I don't know. How do I say no? I should say no, but da da da. So maybe accept the kind offer of food or a snack. And then as the time goes on, they're like, oh my God, the case manager's coming by. Oh, I'm exhausted. I'm going to have to cook for them. It's like you suddenly don't want what a kind gesture to be is a responsibility. So it always involves some measure of conversation in the relationship and looking what the implications might be from aerosol. Even if you were to accept the kind offer, what would a conversation look like in terms of, well, it would be fine for this one time. Thank you so much. But does that feel like, again, a disrespectful act of like only this one time? I mean, so any of a number of ways of thinking about what would the conversation look like that would uphold our cherished principles and be respectful and culturally attuned. Um, so here we're thinking maybe in terms of professional boundaries, what are norms, potential risks and benefits, and the perspectives of our colleagues. Identifying potential conflicts of interest, who may benefit and who may be harmed. So we're if we were to use another model that I mentioned briefly, it's called the power analysis. One of the things that would be important to identify here are who are the stakeholders? Now, the stakeholders might be the people involved, Marisol and the worker, and maybe the people who receive services at this particular salon, and maybe the community, and maybe the profession. So decisions that we make when you think about a power analysis often first identify who are the stakeholders, who has a voice, who holds more or less power in the situation. How to define power? Is power based on who the person is relative to their financial situation, their ability to provide a service for the worker, or is power determined based on the worker's knowledge of that client, of their intimate lives and deeds? So, how do we define power? Who holds the power, and who gets a voice in what happens or what doesn't happen? So, we're thinking in terms of potential conflicts. Is a dual relationship concern? If we're crossing that boundary, how do we uncross that? What does it mean in terms of being client-centered? How do we do that in a way that doesn't just uphold white supremacy culture? Can it lead to ideas of perceived favoritism? That this worker particularly gets favored treatment versus others. I mean, so we don't know, but again, these might be questions we just want to hold in our minds and in our thoughts. I've alluded to the power and justice issues. Again, thinking about what does justice look like here? How do we ensure that what an innocuous acceptance of this offer might be to reinforce power dynamics or to move from being not client-centered, but us-centered? And, when it comes to, we'll come to bartering in a moment, when we come to bartering arrangements, what if we're not satisfied with the service? What what do we do into that situation? What do we do in that situation when we're effectively seeing our client as an employee? That profoundly changes the dynamic. So, again, possible courses of action are things that need to be explored. In this situation, I'll just tell you so it's not a cliffhanger. Um, what Ayana chose to do is to discuss the implications of this and chooses to have a conversation with Marisol with no sense of obligation or coercion. But what you decided is though I, uh, I am so appreciative of the offer, I think what I might prefer to do instead is to find ways of helping support your business. So it might be ensuring that there's no social obligation that is incumbent upon Marisol, but it might be, managing again that even it'll what does that really mean to support the business? Do I tell my friends about this? Um, do I just, so even in that, one has to consider, well, what does that really mean? How do we do that in a way that, again, supports client autonomy, confidentiality? So there may be no perfect solution, but I think it may be clear at this point that the dual relationship would involve accepting the offer of service and finding a lovely way to say, no, thank you. It might be just the offer is kind enough, the work you're doing is reward enough. You don't need to provide additional services, and we can just leave it at that. So, anyway, we have 20 minutes. So, we're going to do a little practice. I'm going to read through a vignette with you, and then you'll be assigned to some breakout groups for about 7 minutes. And what, again, I want you to think about, and maybe you should just jot this down before we go into the breakout groups, is, we don't have to be sticklers about it, but just think about the steps of the model, which are identifying relevant information, the ethical standards at stake, and harms and benefits. I mean, so you don't have to go through each of these, but really to have a robust discussion about what are some of the issues that really pop out to you of interest and concern. All right. So taking it back to, so this is a vignette that's similar to the one we just read. It has to do with an ethical dilemma regarding a bartering arrangement. So you work in a nonprofit. Um, okay, okay. You work in a nonprofit social service organization in a multiracial, multicultural community that provides a range of counseling and concrete services. One of your clients, the Robinson family, has been seeing you for over a year. to address marital and family problems that arose after the teenage son was killed in a drive-by shooting. Mr. Robinson works in construction and belongs to a union that provides good health care benefits. Ms. Robinson is a teacher in a neighborhood pre-K center. They have two other children. At their last session, Mr. Robinson told you he was laid off recently and that his health benefits, which would cover the cost of the counseling sessions, will terminate within a month. The Robinsons have little savings, and what they have managed to save, they plan to use for college for their remaining children. Mr. Robinson is a skilled carpenter and electrician. He asked if he could do some work on your row house as a payment for the session until he's able to return to his regular job. Otherwise, the Robinsons would have to terminate their relationship with you. So in a moment, you'd be assigned randomly to breakout rooms. So again, you don't need to hold on to every detail of this, but consider the nature of the request, the bartering arrangement. Think about what you may know or have heard about bartering relative to the code of ethics. And think about by the time you're done, we'll plan for 7:42. So we'll plan for uh, 8 minutes, and we'll come back and we'll see what did you come up with? Did you come up with a possible solution and come up with an idea in terms of how you might explain that solution to Mr. Robinson? So, um, okay, if I can request for Tina or whomever is
Yeah.
if we get people
I
up to the
can
breakout
open the
rooms
rooms if you're ready.
anytime. Thank you. Ready.
Okay. They're open and everybody should get a pop-up to join. Okay, so currently it's 7 minutes and then they'll receive a pop-up at after 7 minutes for the last minute.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Tina.
And oh, so cool. The three of us are left on there. I'm wondering if I can stop the share. I mean, the screen share, and it might be a lot to have 90 people on screen.
I know. It's tricky to see. I think you can look along the top if you view it in gallery mode, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't seem like anybody stormed out yet. That's good.
Yeah. There. Captive audience. Boy, it is a dilemma when you get a great contractor available.
Yeah. Well, I'm always like, what if they do a terrible job? What if you don't, I mean, like, right?
Well, that could happen anyway. I'm sure.
Yeah.
I
And
was
then,
thinking, what about a friend? Can you refer them to a friend? But then you still know there's still a connection, you know? It's tough.
mm, yeah, that's tricky. Um,
Um,
yeah. So even as I'm thinking about this vignette, how would you advise, going back to the previous vignette, how would you advise them to help the business? Well, you can't really do that because again, if it upends confidentiality.
yes, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. In fact, I was just remembering a contractor that we got from a friend's church list. And we have a new course on faith leaders doing mental health counseling, and they're
Oh,
also in similar ethical dilemmas that they hadn't really anticipated in the past. It's tough.
yeah, yeah. I mean, so yeah, with that example, somebody wanted me to be their therapist, and I said, yeah, I just said, well, what would that be like for you? And
Mhm.
they thought about it. Like, yeah, that would be weird. Like, can I go up and talk to you? Should I not? I mean, I currently sing with the Boston Gay Men's Chorus here in Boston,
Oh,
and I would
yes.
say I
Yes.
have I have like several former clients who are in the group. Um,
Oh gosh.
Several people who are current lovers or former partners of clients, and it's like
Oh gosh. We're a
everywhere I
small,
turn, and be like, oh, I'm sorry.
it's a small town no matter what.
It's a small town. It is absolutely, yeah.
Oh goodness.
So I don't know if you're recording the session.
We'll edit later.
Okay, yeah.
Yes.
Just edit out the spicy bits.
We have folks from Marcom who are signed up to help us do that, and they'll add like a slide before and a slide after and edit out.
Oh, lovely.
Very
All right.
skilled. Yes.
I think this time I might ask people to just speak.
I think that's fine at this point. You've had everyone captive and on their best behavior.
Yeah, I'm surprised with like 90 some odd people. There were more people who, unmuted themselves.
In
It
and
only
out.
happened
Yes,
maybe
that
once or
happens.
twice.
That does
Um,
happen.
so I don't know if you can monitor. I won't be able to see necessarily who, I guess, I don't know if everyone knows how to use the raise hand function.
Yeah, they could do that, or we've had people just chime in. I don't know if
Okay.
there's perhaps in this setting, maybe the raised hand, and then you could, I don't, can you see the
I think,
raised hand?
Yeah,
I,
it should pop up.
yeah, maybe if Tina, you can moderate it. Yeah. Yeah. If people start just talking, I think with 90 people, chances are people are going to be talking
Yes.
to each other. Um, chaos will ensue.
Yes, it will.
Um,
Okay.
but at least we can see each person. We have about
That's
12 minutes left. Yeah.
oh, okay.
Is there
Tina,
anything you can do at the end, Allison, to wrap things up?
Tina will come in at the end.
Okay.
After you're done, you can just go straight and to Tina, and she'll do a quick synopsis of how they can access the course, the post-test, and the evaluation, and
Okay.
do their own CE certificate for the
Okay.
program. So
Okay.
Yeah, and
that's
if you want to use it at the time, it's okay. Like I'll just send them an email. It'll be fine.
oh, that's true too. Yeah, we can also follow up with an email with the instructions. It's very basic.
Mhm.
Um, So we'll keep it. And Tina, would you be able to see their hands raised and
Yeah, we can all see the hands raised because like
great.
their screen will like pop to like the beginning and you'll see like a little emoji next to their square.
Hmm.
Oh,
And they can also participate through the chat.
yes.
Hmm.
And I thought that was very natural how you brought that into the conversation. That was great.
Yeah, it was, yeah, easy. It's like, I'm used to like doing it with 50 people, not 90 people, but it's fine. It's still work.
I was thinking the MSW classes probably are big too. Yeah.
So we have in the online program, we have 15 per class. So
Their
there's no
session
class larger
only.
than 15.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
So it's pretty manageable. You can see everybody on the screen at the same time. That works out really well.
Great.
So thank you. This has gone like super smoothly from like just no
Oh, you're
glitches.
not done yet.
Well, there's one moment when some pop-up said you have unstable Wi-Fi, and it kind of went, oh, but
Oh, I did not. That was
it would only probably
ever
been.
so brief. That was 30 seconds and you were back.
Oh, so I did go away for 30 seconds.
I
There
think
was
it's more
a
right
freeze
now.
Ah, okay.
and we're back.
Okay. Yeah.
And the Zoom rooms will completely close out in 30 seconds. So people are definitely coming back.
Wonderful.
Hey, people are slowly coming back in.
Mhm.
We had a nice chance to meet people, either friends and colleagues or people from other parts of the country, of the world. Um, we'll get going in a minute when everyone's back.
Everybody's back now.
Everybody's back. Okay, welcome back, everybody. So you've been listening to me blather for now an hour and 50 minutes, and now's a chance to hear. I wish we could hear from everybody, but hopefully had an opportunity to talk in small groups, to hear a range of different ideas and thoughts, to also meet people from other parts of the country and other disciplines in social work. So I guess broadly the question is, and you can respond either just by doing raise hand and feel free to speak out to the group, or you can put your responses in chat. So I guess the big question is, do you think it would be ethical to accept the offer of the bartering arrangement? And maybe that if so, yes, and or if not, no, and if not sure, yeah. So what do you think might be certainly the things that weigh into the decision? So we don't have to go into depth with the decision-making model, but if you, and you may not have come to a consensus as a group, but what were some of the things that captured your attention about the vignette and maybe ultimately what you think the decision might be?
Do you want us to use
So,
our words or be in the chat?
uh, you can, you can use your words. So if you want to put
Okay,
your
cool.
and you can just
So
use your
what
words in the chat. Yes.
Okay. So what we were talking about in our group that I think we all initially had was that obviously no bartering system thing, but possibly using a sliding scale. So for example, the whatever co-payment they might have, using that as the session precedent for a certain amount of time because
Mhm.
we don't want to establish that, oh, this is what you can just do forever. Or there can also be that possibility of handoff to another provider that may better suit their needs.
Yes, thank you. So it seems to be a general consensus that bartering, probably no, but proposing alternative fee structure, sliding scale, a gentle, warm handoff to colleagues. Yeah. So those are certainly other options, but what concerned folks about the idea of the bartering arrangement? So I'm guessing that many of you were probably, "Nah, I don't think so. I'm not sure, or just hell
Liabilities,
no. I'm sorry?
liabilities,
Like, could you say more? Liabilities like,
like for safety reasons, because
um,
he doesn't have insurance. What if he were to get hurt while working on your house? What if liabilities, for both parties?
that's, I hadn't even thought about that, but that's right. So what in terms of like the risk to the homeowner, the worker would happen if there's a, like, right? So what are the liability issues in the occasion of an injury? Yes, really, yeah, really good point.
We were very concerned about the change in the relationship and the power structure because someone that's doing work on your house, you have a very different relationship with them than you do with someone you're giving, doing therapy with.
So people coming into your personal space, your home, they have access to, I mean, so again, just what is that like? What does that mean for you in terms of your own, personal boundaries? And what do you imagine that's going to change about the relationship, which is, do you take time out of the therapy session to confer about how things are going with the project, or no, well, let's take 5 minutes after the session? Do you like how? I mean, sometimes I'm a very concrete thinker, but like, how would you even negotiate that? How would that even like work? Um, so other folks weigh in on what were some of the things that really persuaded you that maybe this would be an okay decision, or maybe I need to get more, gathering more facts, more information, or what other things factored into your decision?
I think another concern is you're essentially their employer now, where you have this equal, the clinical relationship we're looking at is more of a teamwork, a collaborative type of relationship. But now here you are, as you say, the kind of the power dynamic shifts, and you're now essentially their employer, even though you're not. I would think kind of, I kind of look at it at that type of relationship.
Yes. Well, there, and you've really articulated quite beautifully the nature of the dual relationship. I'm both their worker and I'm their employer, and I can't know how that's going to work when those boundaries blur and you're responding. So I'm looking at some of the comments in the chat. Um, very interesting comments. I think one was, what if we don't like the work they do?
Yes.
I mean, that's not, this is your home. What if the work is substandard? What if they, no, I've never known a contractor to do this, but what if they just leave you high and dry? That never happens, right? It may not happen in this, but then it just changes the nature of the relationship in really weird ways. So we had some wonderful alternatives in terms of some uncertainty. It wasn't clear that the social worker should not accept the work. So in which case, if we're uncertain, what then do we need to do in terms of gathering more facts? And somebody mentioned in the chat, what is the culture of the community? In some rural communities, bartering would be the norm. So why should this be different? If this is a cultural norm within the community, um, I have a close friend and colleague who lives up in like rural Vermont, and everyone barters for everything. I'll cook this for you if you do that for me. If you can fix my, my hot tub, I can do that. I mean, everyone's bartering everything. And I think we have to be acknowledging that within the work we do, is it a manifestation of white supremacy to say we're special, or is it a recognition of the power of the fiduciary role we have in that relationship? So I'm just going to see if there are any other. So the dual relationship with a very personal, I don't know if I want, wouldn't say this, I don't know if I want you to know where I live. Um, we may find other ways to think it, but the idea of like that we have a private life, and what does that feel like? Somebody wrote quite powerfully, it's sacred. And I would kindly decline and encourage Mr. Robinson to connect with job search. We provide coaching, other opportunities. So there are other options available. Um, so others who'd like to speak up and out in terms of what interested you, what was complicated, what you were uncertain about, or what you
We,
were thinking about.
in our group, we wondered if there was a way to try to empower the couple, uh, uh, with regards to they've been speaking with this person for just a little over a year. Maybe the counselor can take some time to talk about the things that they've learned and empower them that they can do this for a short time
Yeah.
before they meet again or something.
Yeah. So I love the invoking of the principle of empowerment. Maybe there's some things we can draw from the work together that can help them make decisions about what they need to do to help deal with this reversal in their livelihood. I mean, again, that's a much bigger issue. What is it like to live without income? What is it going to be like for them to face the situation? So we want to be seen as caring about that and also helping leverage some of the skills or advocacy that may be needed that go beyond our particular relationship. So, thinking again about the particular, like, should I, shouldn't I, we may also need to attend to the bigger picture, which is what can we use to help mobilize the work we've done towards advocacy on behalf of retaining other insurance? What can we do in the meantime that this may be a temporary situation? So how do we hold a space for them, which may be doing the work pro bono? So any of a number of alternatives, but I kind of get the feeling that there's some, I mean, understandable uh, if not apprehension, they need to really investigate and explore and be intentional. If we're coloring out of the lines to support this, what the reasons for doing so, and are there other alternatives we could explore first? So with that, we're almost at 3 o'clock. My goodness. Um, Time flies when you're having fun. I hope you had fun. I hope it was at least gratifying and interesting and got you thinking about boundaries as such a multifaceted, interesting, complex component of the ethical kind of core to our skill set and our tools. And then maybe think through having these conversations with friends and with colleagues. And feel free, you're welcome to reach out to me. If you'd like, I'm always keen on helping people think through resources to deal with the ethical dilemmas. And if you're looking for resources as well, I'll be sharing with other network program resources. So anyway, thank you all so much for being a part of this. I wish I could have had a chance to meet with you all and hear from you all, but the comments that came through and your level of attention was really much appreciated.